Wow, your appearance and your age left a very influential person completely shocked, and now he cannot understand why you are still running through his mind. Why did seeing you affect him this strongly? Because this was not just physical attraction. The Two of Cups reversed appears here as a symbol of emotional tension, because something about this connection immediately disturbed his normal sense of control. He expected to notice you, perhaps appreciate your appearance for a moment, and then continue with his day. But that is not what happened. The moment he really looked at you, he started noticing everything. Your face, your eyes, the way you carried yourself, the way you moved when you thought nobody important was watching. Even the expression you made while listening to someone else stayed in his memory. But there was one detail that confused him more than anything else. Your age. He could not make your appearance match the age he imagined. Either you looked significantly younger than he expected, or there was something unusually mature, composed, and powerful in your presence that made him question his first assumption completely. And that contradiction fascinated him. What exactly caught his attention first? Your face and your energy together. Because this was not the kind of attraction where someone simply thinks that person is good looking and forgets about it 5 minutes later. No. Something about your expression created an immediate reaction. He tried to remain normal. He tried to keep his attention on whatever was happening around him. But internally, he kept returning to you. Your eyes bothered him in the strangest way. Not because there was anything wrong with them, but because he felt like your gaze was harder to read than he expected. And this is someone who is normally very good at reading people. He is accustomed to walking into situations where others notice his status, his influence, his confidence, perhaps even his money or reputation. People often reveal themselves around him very quickly. But you didn't. You were not trying hard enough to impress him, and that made him look again. What happened after that? He started comparing you. Without even intending to, he mentally placed you beside other people he normally finds attractive, interesting, or impressive. And something felt different. He could not explain exactly what you had that they didn't. That is when curiosity became dangerous. Because later, when you were no longer in front of him, he was still thinking about tiny details. Your posture, your voice, a brief expression on your face, the way you turned away. And then one question entered his mind that he did not expect to be asking at all. Why am I still thinking about this person? That question was only the beginning. Because the more he tried to dismiss it, the more his mind returned to you. At first he told himself it was simply novelty. Maybe you looked different from the people he normally noticed. Maybe the confusion about your age had made the interaction stand out more than it normally would. Maybe he was just curious. That explanation worked for a few hours. Then something happened. He would be focused on something completely unrelated, and suddenly he would remember the expression on your face when someone said something to you, or your voice, or the exact moment you looked away from him. And that started bothering him. The King of Swords reversed appears here as a symbol of disrupted mental control, because this is someone who normally trusts his own judgment. He likes understanding situations quickly. He likes knowing what people want, and more importantly, he is accustomed to deciding where his attention goes. But with you, his attention was beginning to behave differently. He could redirect it. He just couldn't keep it redirected. And there was one particular contradiction he kept returning to. Your appearance still did not match what he thought he understood about your age. He actually questioned whether he had heard correctly. Was that really your age? Had he misunderstood something? Because the more he replayed your face, your mannerisms, and the way you carried yourself, the less certain he became about his original impression. But it wasn't only that. There was something about your composure that confused him too. You had not given him enough information, not emotionally. You didn't seem nervous enough for him to assume you were intimidated. You didn't seem impressed enough for him to assume his position mattered greatly to you, but you weren't cold either, and that left him with nothing easy to categorize. What did that do to him? It made him curious in a way he was not comfortable admitting. Because now he wasn't only wondering why you looked the way you did. He was wondering who you actually were. There was even one small reaction of yours that kept returning to him. Something understated, maybe a slight smile, maybe the way you listened without immediately responding, maybe the way you looked at him and then calmly returned your attention somewhere else. It was nothing dramatic, but that was exactly the problem. You had affected him without appearing to make any effort to do it. And eventually, thinking was no longer enough. He wanted information. Not enough to make his interest obvious. Not enough for anyone to start asking questions. Just one small detail that could help him understand what he was dealing with. So he found a subtle way to learn a little more about you. And what he discovered did not answer his questions. It made them worse. Because the first thing he tried to confirm was something simple. Your age. Not by asking you directly. That would have revealed too much. Instead, he listened more carefully when your name came up. He noticed a detail someone mentioned. Maybe a year, maybe how long you had been doing something, maybe a reference to a stage of your life that suddenly gave him a much clearer idea, and when he understood it, he paused, because it still did not match. If you were older than he originally thought, your appearance made even less sense to him. There was something unusually fresh about you, not childish, not immature, just difficult to place. And if you were younger than he assumed, then your composure became the mystery instead, because you carried yourself like someone who had already learned things he expected people to learn much later. Either way, his original reading of you had been wrong. The Ace of Wands reversed appears here as a symbol of attraction that does not immediately know where to go. The interest is there, strongly, but instead of acting on it, he hesitates. Because now he realizes he may have underestimated you completely, and that is where his questions started multiplying. Were you single? Were you involved with someone? What kind of life did you actually live when nobody important was around? Had something happened in your past that made you this self-contained? Why did you seem so comfortable in your own space? And most importantly, why had his presence not changed your behaviour more? That question bothered him, because he is used to seeing the moment people become aware of who he is. Their voice changes, their posture changes, sometimes they become more agreeable, sometimes more nervous, sometimes suddenly much more interested. But when he thought back to you, he couldn't find much of that. You seemed aware of him, but not consumed by him. There is a difference. And he noticed it. He even started reconsidering moments he had dismissed earlier. Maybe you had not looked away because you were shy. Maybe you simply had something else to focus on. Maybe that small smile had not been designed to attract him at all. Maybe you were just being yourself, and strangely, that possibility affected him more, because now he was dealing with something he rarely had to question. Your motive. What did you want from him? He kept searching mentally for the answer. Attention? Approval? Access? A connection? Something? But the more he examined your behaviour, the more uncomfortable the answer became. You did not seem to be trying to get anything from him. And that was the detail that began changing the way he behaved around you. Because for once, he was no longer asking himself what you thought of his position. He was asking what you thought of him, personally. And that was different. He started replaying the interaction from your side. Did you find him interesting? Did you notice the way he kept looking at you? Had you sensed that his attention was becoming more focused? Or had you simply gone on with your day without giving him nearly as much thought as he was giving you? That possibility irritated him more than he expected. The Six of Swords appears here as a symbol of someone mentally moving away from what usually feels familiar, because normally he understands the dynamic. Other people make the effort. They find reasons to continue conversations. They mention something impressive about themselves. They become more attentive once they understand what he can offer. But you had done almost none of that. You were attentive without chasing him, polite without performing for him, and attractive without constantly checking whether he noticed. That last part stayed with him. Because he did notice, probably more than you realized. And now something subtle was reversing. Instead of you trying to earn his attention, he was beginning to wonder how he could earn a stronger reaction from you. Not because you were deliberately withholding anything. You weren't playing difficult. That would have been easier for him to understand. You simply seemed comfortable enough with yourself that his approval was not necessary, and that made your attention feel more valuable. He even questioned whether you had recognized his interest at all. Maybe you assumed he was simply being courteous. Maybe you thought he treated everyone that way. Maybe that look he thought was obvious had meant absolutely nothing to you. And suddenly, this very confident person was dealing with an unfamiliar uncertainty. How did I come across to you? That was the question now. Not, did you notice who I am, but, did you notice me? There is a big difference. And once that difference entered his mind, his behaviour began changing. He started thinking about another opportunity to speak with you, nothing dramatic. Just enough time to see what happened when your attention was actually directed toward him. Would you become warmer, more curious? Would your eyes reveal something they had not revealed before? And eventually, that opportunity came. You were there again, and almost immediately, he made one small adjustment, something he probably thought nobody would notice. His position, his timing, his attention. He changed it because you were in the room. But there was one problem. Someone who knew him well was watching, and they noticed. And that changed something immediately. Because the moment he realized someone else had noticed, he became more careful, not less interested, more careful. There is a difference. The tower reversed appears here as a symbol of someone trying to contain a disruption before anyone else can see how much it is affecting him. Outwardly, he pulled himself back together. He returned his attention to the conversation. He adjusted his expression. He made sure he was not looking at you too often. But internally, the opposite was happening. Now he was even more aware of where you were. He noticed when you spoke. He noticed when someone approached you. He noticed when you laughed at something that had nothing to do with him. And at one point, someone near him gave him a look. Nothing dramatic. Just a look that said they had seen enough. Maybe they asked a casual question. Do you know them? Maybe they mentioned you in a slightly teasing tone. Or maybe they simply smiled when his attention moved in your direction again. And he understood immediately. His interest was becoming visible. That bothered him. Because this is not someone who likes being easy to read, so he became more controlled. But then you spoke to him again, and almost without thinking, his tone changed. Slightly warmer, more attentive. He remembered something you had said before. A small detail most people would have forgotten. And when you reacted to the fact that he remembered it, he watched your face very closely. Because he wanted that reaction. That was new. Then something about your age came up again. Maybe indirectly, maybe through a story you told, maybe through another person mentioning something about your life, and once again, he looked at you as though the information simply refused to match the person standing in front of him. That same confusion returned. But now it was mixed with something else. Investment. He was no longer observing you casually. He was beginning to care what happened next, so he tried to suppress it. He told himself to keep everything appropriate, keep everything normal, do not reveal too much. But controlling the outside did nothing to calm the inside. If anything, it made the question stronger, because now he had seen you again. He had watched himself behave differently around you, and someone else had noticed it too. So the question changed. It was no longer, why am I attracted to you? Now, he was asking something much more dangerous. What would actually happen if I pursued this? And for the first time, he actually allowed himself to think about the consequences. Not the fantasy, the reality, because pursuing you would not necessarily be simple. This is someone whose choices may be noticed. People watch who he spends time with. They notice who receives more attention. They ask questions. And depending on his position, even something private can become complicated very quickly. The 3 hairs reversed appears here as a symbol of competing considerations, pulling his mind in different directions. Because one part of him wanted to follow the attraction. Another part immediately began calculating everything that could make it difficult. Your age difference, if there is one, your different lifestyles, the circles you both move in, how other people might react. And perhaps the biggest question of all, would you even want this? He could not assume that. Especially with you. You had already shown him that his influence did not automatically guarantee your interest. And logically, all of these complications should have cooled him down. But they didn't. Strangely, thinking about the practical side made you feel more real to him. That surprised him, because he has probably had easier opportunities. People who made their interest obvious. People who would have happily accepted his attention without making him question anything. But those situations did not follow him home mentally. You did. And then his thoughts became even more revealing. He stopped imagining only how attractive you looked. Instead, he wondered what you would be like in a quiet conversation. What would you say if nobody else were listening? What actually makes you laugh? Would you challenge his opinions? Would you become softer once you felt comfortable around him? He even imagined something completely ordinary, sitting beside you somewhere without anyone needing anything from either of you, just talking. And that was the moment he caught himself, because his mind had gone further than he intended. This was supposed to be attraction, curiosity, nothing more complicated than that. So why was he suddenly imagining what it would feel like to have access to the private version of you? He pulled himself back, at least mentally. But something had already changed. Because once he started considering you as a real possibility, he also became more sensitive to the idea of other people noticing you, someone else getting close to you, someone else making you laugh, someone else discovering the things about you he had only begun wondering about, and he did not like that reaction in himself, because he knew perfectly well that he had no claim over you. None. Yet something surprisingly protective and slightly possessive had already started appearing. And it happened much faster than he wanted to admit. And the first real sign of that appeared when someone else started paying attention to you. Not aggressively, not enough to create a scene, just enough for him to notice. Maybe someone stayed in conversation with you a little longer than necessary. Maybe they complimented you. Maybe he saw the way another person looked at you and immediately recognized it, because he knew that look. He had been giving you some version of it himself, and his reaction surprised him. The sunrise appears here as a symbol of something becoming impossible to ignore once it is brought into the light, because, until that moment, his feelings had mostly existed privately. He could analyze them, control them, tell himself they were temporary. But seeing someone else notice you forced him to confront something uncomfortable. Other people could see what he saw. Your appearance, your confidence, that strange difficulty of placing your age. The combination that had confused him so much was not necessarily invisible to everyone else. And suddenly he became much more attentive. Who was this person talking to you? Did you know them well? Were you interested? He did not ask. He knew better than that. But internally the questions appeared immediately. Then he watched you smile at something they said, and something in him tightened. Not because you had done anything wrong, you hadn't, and he knew perfectly well that he had no right to feel jealous. That was what made the reaction so irritating. He had no claim over you. He had not told you how he felt. He had barely admitted it to himself. So why did the idea of someone else getting there first bother him? That question stayed with him, because now another possibility entered his mind. Maybe he had been too cautious. Maybe while he was analysing every detail, somebody else would simply act. Someone without his complications. Someone who did not care who was watching. Someone willing to make their interest obvious. And for the first time, waiting no longer felt completely safe. He started wondering whether his restraint could actually work against him. But he was not ready to rush toward you blindly either. There was still one thing he needed to understand. Your reaction to him. Not your politeness. Not whether you respected his position. Not whether you could hold a conversation with him. He wanted to know whether something changed in you when the attention became personal. Did your eyes stay on him differently? Did your voice shift? Did you become more aware of him when he moved closer? Because if he was going to stop hiding his interest, even slightly, he needed some indication that he was not walking toward a closed door. And that is when he began watching you for an answer. So he started paying attention to things he normally would not need to analyze. Your eye contact, your tone, how quickly you answered him, whether you seemed completely relaxed when he moved closer, or whether something subtle changed. And the frustrating part, nothing was obvious. Sometimes your eyes stayed on slightly longer than he expected. Then you would look away naturally. Sometimes your voice seemed warmer with him. But then he would hear you speak warmly to someone else too. You gave him just enough to wonder, not enough to know. The Ace of Swords reversed appears here as a symbol of unclear communication and a person who cannot get the certainty he wants. Because normally, he trusts what he sees. He reads reactions quickly. But with you, every answer seemed to create another question. Were you interested? Possibly. Were you simply comfortable? Also possible. And that ambiguity started getting to him, so eventually, he tested it, very carefully. He asked you something slightly more personal than the conversation required. Nothing inappropriate. Just something that moved the interaction away from surface-level politeness. Maybe he asked what you actually thought about something. Maybe he asked about your plans. Maybe he made a sincere observation about you that showed he had been paying closer attention than you realized. And then he watched. What did you do? You did not dramatically reveal anything. But you also did not shut him down. You answered. You stayed engaged. Maybe there was a small pause before you responded. Maybe your expression softened. Maybe you looked directly at him for a second that felt unusually long. It was subtle, but it was enough to keep hope alive. And that mattered more than he expected, because by now he was no longer only asking whether you found him attractive. Something deeper had entered the picture. He wanted to know what you thought of him when the status was removed. Did you respect the person behind the influence? Did you enjoy talking to him? Would you still be curious if nobody else knew who he was? That was becoming important. And he did not entirely like how important, because physical attraction would have been simpler. This was beginning to touch his ego in a very different place. He wanted your genuine opinion, your genuine attention. Not the version people give him because of what he represents, and after that exchange, he thought about it for longer than he intended. Then, something settled in his mind, a private decision. He was not going to keep standing at a distance, analysing every look and every word. He was going to create a clearer opening, not recklessly, not publicly, but intentionally, and once he made that decision, the energy around this connection was about to change. And that decision was more important than it looked, because he was no longer waiting for another accidental moment with you. He was thinking about how to create one. Carefully. The Four of Swords reversed appears here as a symbol of someone who can no longer remain mentally still. He had spent enough time thinking, enough time observing, enough time convincing himself that this interest might eventually disappear on its own. It hadn't. So now his approach started becoming more intentional. Maybe he found a natural reason to speak with you again. Maybe he continued a conversation that had ended too soon. Maybe he asked a question that gave you room to reveal something more personal. Or perhaps he suggested something simple. Coffee, a conversation, a reason to stay in contact. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would force you into an uncomfortable position. Because despite his influence, he does not want your response to come from pressure. That would defeat the entire point. What he wants now is something genuine. And that realization changes everything. Because somewhere during all of this, his thoughts had moved beyond simply wanting your attention. He started wondering whether the two of you would actually fit, not only physically, in real life. Would your personalities work together? Would you understand the parts of his life that other people find difficult? Would he feel comfortable bringing you into his private world? And then his mind went somewhere that surprised even him. He briefly imagined you around people who actually matter to him, not an audience, not business contacts. The people who know him when the public version disappears, and strangely, the image did not feel impossible. It felt natural enough that he immediately pulled away from the thought, because that was too far, wasn't it? He barely understood what was happening between you. And yet he was already thinking in terms of compatibility, possibility, what something serious might actually look like. That is when the attraction crossed another line. The age question that originally shocked him was still there. Your appearance still fascinated him. He still found himself looking at your face and wondering how his first impression had been so wrong. But now those things were becoming secondary, because the more he thought about you, the more he realized something. Your appearance may have caught him, your age may have confused him, but neither one fully explains why you stayed in his mind, and that is the part he is only beginning to understand, because the real reason you affected him this deeply has very little to do with what he saw. It has everything to do with what he felt when you did not react to him, the way everyone else does. And that is where the real answer begins, because what stayed with him was not simply how you looked. It was how he felt around you, more alert, more curious, slightly challenged, and strangely unable to rely on the things that usually make interactions easy for him. The moon appears here as a symbol of uncertainty, because you never gave him a simple explanation for what he was feeling. He could not completely read you. Your eyes revealed something, but not enough. Your voice felt warm at times, but never desperate for his approval. Your posture had confidence in it. Your expressions changed naturally without constantly checking whether he was watching. And all of that created a strange effect. He could not reduce you to one category. Attractive, yes, but that was not enough. Youthful or mature in a way that confused his expectations, yes, but even that was not enough. What really stayed with him was your independence from his reaction. You did not appear to need him to validate you. And because of that, every piece of attention you gave him felt more meaningful. He could not assume it, he had to notice it. That changed the entire dynamic. Because someone who is accustomed to influence is often surrounded by people who make their intentions easy to understand. But you made him wonder. Not because you were manipulating him, because you seemed to have a life inside yourself that existed whether he entered it or not. And now his original question has changed completely. At first it was, why am I still thinking about you? Now it is becoming something else. What would I regret if I never found out who you really are? That is a much more serious question, because it is no longer about satisfying curiosity. It is about possibility. Could this actually become something? Could you fit into the private part of his life? Could this move beyond attraction into something stable enough that he would have to make real decisions around it? He does not know yet, and neither should this be treated like a promise. But the fact that his mind has reached that question tells you how far the situation has already moved. Your appearance was the first thing that caught him. Your age was the shock that disrupted his assumptions. But your presence became the reason he stayed interested. The eyes, the voice, the composure, the small reactions, the fact that you saw someone influential and still remained yourself, that is what he cannot easily forget. Because sometimes the person who believes they are difficult to impress becomes most affected by the one person who was never trying to impress them at all.